There's a moment in every workplace when the ground shifts beneath your feet, when power reveals itself to be an illusion, and the person you dismissed becomes the architect of your downfall. For Marcus Webb, manager of Speedway Logistics in Atlanta, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon when a simple phone call rewrote everything he believed about hierarchy, respect, and the cost of cruelty. James Holloway had never been one for grand entrances. At 53, with silver threading through his dark hair and hands calloused from 30 years of honest work, he moved through the world with the kind of quiet that made people forget he was there. That Tuesday morning, he pulled into the Speedway Logistics Distribution Center in a 1998 Ford F-150, the truck he'd driven since his youngest daughter turned 18. It was faded blue, reliable, nothing remarkable. The scratch on the passenger door had been there for 4 years. He didn't mind. He was wearing a simple grey polo shirt with James H. embroidered on the pocket, purchased from a uniform company that morning. His new driver's license sat in the glove compartment along with his coffee in a dented stainless steel thermos. At 5 in the morning, the parking lot had been nearly empty. He'd done everything right. Arrived 30 minutes early, checked in with dispatch, received his route assignment for the day. Marcus Webb hadn't arrived until 6:47 a.m., exactly 13 minutes before James was scheduled to leave for his first delivery. Marcus was 34, ambitious, and carried the kind of confidence that came from never having experienced significant failure. He managed the Speedway Logistics Atlanta facility, one of 4 regional distribution centers in the company's southeastern network. The job paid well, offered solid benefits, and Marcus had decided early on that the path to promotion lay in demonstrating absolute control over operations. The problem Marcus had identified on his second week as manager was disorder. Drivers were too informal. They called dispatch by his first name sometimes. They took breaks without military precision. They joked with each other instead of focusing. And the owner, whoever that distant figure was in some corporate office in Nashville, had clearly been too lenient with operational standards. When Marcus saw James walking across the parking lot toward his assigned vehicle, something about the older man triggered an immediate reaction. Maybe the careful, measured pace, or perhaps the visible confidence in James's bearing, despite being brand new. Marcus had been trained in several management seminars that the first impression set the tone for an entire employment relationship. He intercepted James before the driver reached the truck. "You're the new guy?" James turned, his brown eyes meeting Marcus's with a directness that Marcus immediately found unsettling. "Yes, sir. James Holloway, first day." "I'm Marcus Webb, facility manager." He didn't extend his hand. "Let me be clear about something from the outset. I run a tight operation here. This facility achieves 98% on-time delivery, and that's not an accident. That's discipline. That's respect for protocol." James nodded slowly. "I understand. I've been in delivery logistics for—" "You've been here exactly 0 days," Marcus interrupted. "Don't assume anything. We have a checklist. Morning safety briefing starts in 10 minutes. After that, you'll take your route." He paused, letting his eyes travel up and down James's frame, settling on the worn boots. "And we have a dress code. That polo is acceptable today, but next week wear something with a collar." James had been studying Marcus carefully while the manager spoke. He'd encountered this type many times before, the newly promoted middle manager who mistakes discipline for leadership, control for competence. "I appreciate the guidance," James said. "I'll be at that briefing." The safety briefing was standard: backup procedures, weather awareness, vehicle inspection protocols. Marcus stood at the front, going through slides with the energy of someone performing rather than educating. James listened carefully, asked no questions, and took mental notes. 3 other drivers were present: Tommy, a lanky guy in his 20s, David, middle-aged and weathered, and Keisha, probably in her 50s, with a pragmatic expression that suggested she'd seen many managers come and go. After the briefing, as drivers dispersed, David caught James's arm. "Welcome to the show," he said quietly. "That's Marcus. Good luck with him on your first day." "He seems serious," James offered, non-committally. "Serious is one word for it. Us is another." David glanced around. "Look, I'm just saying, don't let him get under your skin. He's new to managing, trying to prove something. Give it a few weeks, he usually either settles down or gets fired. James smiled slightly. I can handle it. His first route took him through downtown Atlanta and into the suburbs, standard residential and small business deliveries. The company's GPS system was solid, the truck performed well despite its age, and by early afternoon, James had completed 15 of his 19 scheduled stops without issue. He was methodical, professional, and efficient. He treated every customer with respect, carefully placing packages to prevent damage and confirming signatures properly. At 2:15 p.m., he returned to the facility to collect his final packages for delivery. The afternoon dispatcher, a young woman named Cassidy, greeted him warmly. How's the first day going? Smooth, James replied. Good route design, vehicles running well. That's great. We don't always hear that from new drivers, honestly. Marcus can make things tense. James was loading the final packages when Marcus appeared in the warehouse, his expression already dark. He stood watching James work, not speaking, just observing. James felt the weight of that attention, but didn't alter his pace or behavior. He'd learned decades ago that some people needed to feel acknowledged when they wanted to establish dominance. After several minutes, Marcus walked closer. Hey, Holloway, I need to talk to you about your delivery this morning. James set down the package carefully and turned to face Marcus fully. What about it? Customer on Peach Street, Janet Michaels. She called our corporate number to complain about you. This was news to James. The delivery had been standard. The customer had been pleasant, had signed the receipt, had given no indication of any problem. What was her complaint? She said you were rude. You didn't explain what was in the package, didn't make small talk, treated her like you couldn't care less about customer service. James felt something crystallize inside his chest, recognition of injustice, but more importantly, recognition of a pattern. Marcus wasn't reporting a legitimate complaint. Marcus was looking for leverage, for an excuse to establish dominance quickly. I delivered her package professionally and safely, took her signature, and wished her a good day. That is customer service. That's your interpretation, Marcus said coldly. And frankly, after our conversation this morning about standards, I find your attitude disappointing. You've been here less than 8 hours, and you're already generating complaints. There was no legitimate complaint, James said quietly. Who are you to decide what's legitimate? Marcus's voice had risen. Several other people in the warehouse had stopped what they were doing and were watching. I've been managing this facility for 3 months. I've never had this issue before, and I'm not interested in defending your performance to corporate. James remained very still. He could read the situation clearly now. Marcus was looking for a confrontation, for an opportunity to establish absolute control over this older, competent man who had shown no deference in their first interaction. To Marcus, James was a test case, an opportunity to demonstrate to the rest of the staff that he could remove anyone who didn't perform to his standards. I'd like to call the customer to understand her concern, James said. You're not calling anyone. You're done for the day. Actually, you're done, period. You're terminated. The warehouse had gone completely silent. Cassidy, the dispatcher, had her hand over her mouth. David was shaking his head. Keisha was watching with an expression of weary confirmation. She'd clearly seen this kind of thing before. On what grounds? James asked, though he already knew the answer. There were no real grounds. Insubordination, failure to meet customer service standards, unsafe attitude, take your pick. Marcus was speaking louder now, clearly performing for the rest of the staff. Cassidy, process his termination paperwork. He needs to turn in his vehicle keys immediately. Marcus turned back to James. You have 15 minutes to collect your personal items, then you're off the property. James could see the calculation working behind Marcus's eyes, the satisfaction of having removed a threat quickly, of having sent a message to the remaining staff about who held real power in this facility. It was the expression of someone who had made a decision and felt certain about it. All right, James said. He set down his clipboard, turned and walked toward the office to retrieve his belongings. He heard Marcus say to Cassidy, call corporate and let them know. First day termination. Make sure the paperwork reflects performance issues. In the break room, James gathered the few things he'd left that morning, his jacket, his thermos, his copy of the driver handbook. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. Someone else might have felt rage or devastation or panic. James felt something else entirely: the cold certainty that this situation needed to be corrected, and an understanding of exactly how it would be done. He'd retired from Speedway Logistics exactly 2 years earlier, after 30 years with the company. He'd risen through the ranks from driver to regional operations manager, overseeing a workforce of over 200 people across the southeastern region. The job had been demanding and, toward the end, increasingly political, as the company had been consolidated under several different corporate ownership structures. He'd been well compensated for his tenure, had been offered a substantial severance package, and had accepted it gratefully, ready for quieter days. But his retirement had lasted only 14 months before a former colleague, someone he'd mentored, someone he trusted, had approached him with a business proposition. The Speedway Logistics brand was struggling. The company's ownership structure was chaotic, with 3 separate private equity firms holding different regional assets and constantly at odds about operational direction. The result was inconsistent management, declining customer satisfaction, and deteriorating financial performance. What if, his former colleague had suggested, someone with deep knowledge of the company's systems and customers could acquire the primary assets? What if that person could stabilize operations, provide consistent management, and return the company to profitability? James had considered it carefully. He'd always loved the work itself, the logistics, the problem-solving, the satisfaction of reliable operations. He didn't particularly love the identity of businessman or owner, but he'd understood the necessity. 18 months later, after complex negotiations, his investment group had acquired controlling interest in Speedway Logistics' southeastern operations, which included 4 regional distribution centers. The acquisition had been completed quietly, through a holding company that bore his attorney's name as the registered owner. The company's public ownership structure remained essentially unchanged on paper. James had returned to the company deliberately undercover. He'd wanted to understand the operational reality, the actual performance of his facilities, without the filter of management performance and corporate reporting. He'd taken a simple driver position at the Atlanta facility, the facility with the most problematic manager profile according to internal data. He'd driven himself to the facility this morning to assess the actual operations firsthand, to see what Marcus Webb was really like when he thought the owner wasn't watching. He'd seen. Now, pulling out of the Speedway Logistics facility in his old blue F-150, James made a phone call. It was answered on the second ring by his attorney, Robert Chen. "It's done," James said quietly. "We have everything we need." "Already?" Robert sounded surprised. "It's barely past 2 in the afternoon." "The manager I told you about? He fired me. On my first day, in front of the entire warehouse staff. The complaint he cited doesn't exist. He simply wanted to establish dominance." There was a pause. Robert was already thinking through the implications. "That's documented in his management logs?" "It will be. And the dispatcher heard the entire interaction. The other staff heard it. There are witnesses to completely fabricated grounds for termination." "That's actually preferable," Robert said slowly. "It demonstrates pattern behavior, not a one-off bad decision. Combined with the internal audits we've already completed." He trailed off, already planning. "I'll schedule a call with the board for tomorrow. You need to prepare your transition strategy." James ended the call as he merged onto the interstate, heading back toward his home in East Atlanta. The evening sun was creating long shadows across the highway, turning the sky a deep orange. He felt no anger, surprisingly. What he felt was something closer to duty. The understanding that this needed to be addressed, not for personal reasons, but because a man like Marcus Webb couldn't be trusted to lead an organization responsibly. The next morning, James was in Robert Chen's office in Midtown Atlanta, surrounded by 3 other members of his investment group's board. They reviewed the operational data they'd been collecting for 6 months. Performance metrics that had been declining under Marcus's management, customer service complaints that had increased significantly since his arrival, and financial analysis showing deteriorating margins in the Atlanta facility specifically. "The termination yesterday is interesting," said Victoria Simmons, the investment group's CEO, "but it's really just one data point. Are we comfortable moving on it?" "What it demonstrates," James explained, "is judgment. Bad judgment. Vindictive judgment. Marcus hired me deliberately to test me, then used a fabricated complaint as cover to remove me. That's not a manager making a mistake. That's a manager using corporate authority as a tool for personal control. And if we move against him, he'll certainly hire an employment attorney, added Roger Yates, the board's finance director. Claims of wrongful termination, discrimination, the works. Let him, James said. His termination will be documented as part of a comprehensive operational restructuring. We've identified multiple compliance and performance issues in the Atlanta facility. Marcus will be removed as part of a broader management overhaul. It will be entirely defensible, and frankly, his legal costs will be his own problem. The board voted unanimously to authorize James to execute an immediate management transition at the Atlanta facility. By noon, James had returned to the Speedway Logistics facility as the newly revealed owner and regional operations director. He went directly to Marcus's office. Marcus was on his phone when James walked in. He looked up, confused, clearly not recognizing James in anything other than his first-day driver's clothes. "Can I help you?" "I'm James Holloway," James said. "I'm the owner of Speedway Logistics' southeastern operations. 30 years ago, I started as a driver at one of our facilities. Yesterday, you terminated me on the basis of a fabricated complaint." James kept his voice level, almost conversational. "I'm here to inform you that you're being relieved of your duties effective immediately. Your employment will be terminated for cause. Security is standing by to escort you to collect your personal belongings." He watched the color drain from Marcus's face in real time, the moment comprehension finally landed. James could see Marcus calculating backward through the conversation yesterday, reassessing every word, suddenly understanding that the quiet man in the worn boots was not actually a new hire, but someone whose judgment he had fundamentally misread. I don't understand," Marcus stammered. "I was just—" "Establishing dominance," James finished. "Yes, I understand exactly what you are doing. That's precisely why this conversation is happening." The security personnel who had been standing outside the office stepped in and escorted Marcus out. It took 15 minutes to clear his desk and collect his personal items. The process was efficient, professional, and completely unambiguous in its finality. Afterward, James met with the remaining staff in the warehouse. Cassidy looked shocked. David was struggling not to smile. Keisha was watching James with new understanding, clearly reassessing her earlier assumptions about this older man. "My name is James Holloway," he addressed them. "Until yesterday, I was your manager. Well, your owner, technically. I retired 2 years ago and sold my interest in Speedway Logistics to a corporate group that subsequently deteriorated the company's operational performance. I'm here because I care about this organization and because I believe all of you deserve to work in an environment built on respect, not control." He looked directly at Keisha. "I've reviewed the performance data. You should have been promoted to senior driver status a year ago. You're being promoted today, effective immediately, with appropriate compensation increase. You'll also take on some training responsibilities for new hires." Then to David, "Your route efficiency scores are excellent, and your safety record is clean. I want you to interview for the senior dispatcher role. You understand this work better than anyone here." And to Cassidy, "Your organization is extraordinary. You're being reassigned to the corporate office to help implement better dispatch protocols across all our facilities." He paused, letting the weight of change settle. Marcus Webb was terminated for cause. He's gone. Going forward, this facility will be managed by standards of respect, professionalism, and authentic accountability. Not control, not performance theater, real accountability. Are there any questions? There were no questions. There was something better. There was the visible relief of people who had been working under constant low-level stress, suddenly understanding that the rules had changed in their favor. That evening, James drove back to his home in East Atlanta in his blue F-150, the truck his youngest daughter had bought him for his 50th birthday. He'd driven it through his final years as a manager, through his retirement, and now through the beginning of his unexpected return to the company he'd built his life around. The irony wasn't lost on him, that taking the job under false pretenses, being mistreated and being fired, had been the fastest possible way to demonstrate the precise management philosophy he intended to bring to the organization. Sometimes the most effective lesson comes from experience, And Marcus Webb had provided an educational moment that would resonate through the Atlanta facility for years. James pulled into his driveway just as the sun disappeared below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep purple blue. His daughter would be calling soon. It was their Wednesday night call, a tradition since his retirement. He'd tell her that he'd returned to the company, that something interesting had happened, and that he'd explain more soon. But the real story, the quiet man who'd walked into a facility as a delivery driver and left as the owner, the manager who'd tried to establish dominance over someone he didn't understand, the correction that had been necessary, that story would travel through the Speedway Logistics facilities like a parable. It would be told and retold in break rooms and dispatch offices, adapted and embellished, and ultimately understood as something deeper than a simple story about an owner reclaiming his company. It was a story about the danger of dismissing people based on appearance or initial impression. It was a story about the difference between authority and respect. It was a story about what happens when someone mistakes your quiet for weakness, your age for irrelevance, your humility for vulnerability. It was a story about James Holloway, the man in the worn boots who'd driven his first route 30 years ago and never quite left the road, who understood the value of the work more deeply than anyone else in the system, who had chosen to return not as a tyrant, but as a guardian of something worth protecting. The news of Marcus Webb's termination reached the other regional facilities within hours. By the end of the week, facility managers across the southeastern region began receiving notifications of operational audits and management evaluations. By the end of the month, 3 additional managers had been terminated and 5 had been significantly restructured in their roles. Within 6 months, Speedway Logistics' southeastern operations had transformed. Customer satisfaction scores increased by 14%. On-time delivery improved from 98% to 99.2%. Employee retention increased significantly, particularly among senior staff. The facility in Atlanta, which had been the lowest performing location under Marcus Webb's management, became the highest performing facility in the region. James returned to his formal role as Regional Operations Director, but he never left the road entirely. Once a week, he'd still drive a delivery route himself, maintaining hands-on understanding of the work his company performed. The drivers knew him as the owner-manager who understood the job because he'd done the job himself. The respect he commanded was different from what Marcus Webb had attempted to create. It was genuine, built on consistency and authentic care for the people performing the work. Years later, when someone new joined Speedway Logistics at the Atlanta facility, they'd eventually hear the story of the quiet man in the worn boots who'd been fired on his first day by a manager who didn't recognize his own boss. The story had become company legend, the origin point for a fundamental shift in how that organization understood leadership, respect, and the real meaning of power. And James Holloway, 30 years a driver, 3 years an operations manager, 1 year a man in retirement, remained exactly what he'd always been. A person who understood that the most important work is often done quietly. That authority earned through understanding beats authority imposed through fear, and that sometimes the best lesson a person can learn comes from the moment they finally understand how wrong they'd been about someone they'd completely misjudged. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, forwarded through 3 addresses before finally reaching James's office at the Atlanta facility. The envelope was hand-addressed, the penmanship careful and deliberate, the postmark from a federal penitentiary in South Georgia. James recognized the name in the return address immediately: Marcus Webb. He opened it slowly, aware that his administrative assistant, Patricia, was watching from her desk with barely concealed curiosity. The letter was 3 pages, written on prison commissary paper in black ink. Mr. Holloway, I don't expect this letter to mean anything to you. I understand that. I've had 18 months to think about what I owe you, and I'm still not sure I can adequately articulate it. But I'm trying. After you fired me, and I use that word deliberately now, understanding the layers of irony, I was angry. I was humiliated. I spent weeks convinced that you'd set me up somehow, that the whole thing had been orchestrated to embarrass me. I told myself I'd done nothing wrong, that you'd abused your power, that I deserved better. Then I got arrested. James paused, rereading that line. He'd known Marcus had faced legal trouble after his termination, but the specifics hadn't been part of the corporate narrative. James had moved on, focused on the operational improvements at the Atlanta facility. The investigation that led to my arrest started with an audit of facility finances. When you restructured management, your auditors discovered that I'd been falsifying delivery reports and pocketing the difference in fuel reimbursements. It was a small amount, maybe $30,000 over 8 months. But it was systematic. I'd learned it from the previous manager, and I'd thought it was just how things worked, how you got ahead in logistics management. I was convicted of fraud. I'm serving 4 years. I have 2 more to go. In here, I've had a lot of time to understand what I was actually doing. I wasn't just stealing from a company, I was stealing from people who trusted me. I was lying to drivers, falsifying reports, creating a culture where dishonesty was normalized. And the worst part is, I genuinely didn't see it that way when I was doing it. I thought I was being smart, efficient. I thought I was winning. Your termination of me was actually the most honest interaction I'd had in years. You didn't lie, you didn't pretend it was something it wasn't. You looked me in the eye and told me the truth. I'd been wrong. And instead of accepting that, I spent months being angry at you for it. I've thought about that morning you came into my office constantly. The way you stood there, perfectly calm, while my entire understanding of who I was and what I'd accomplished fell apart. I keep replaying it, trying to find the moment where I should have recognized something was wrong with me. Something was broken in how I was approaching everything. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if you'll care. But I wanted you to know that you were right about me, about my judgment, about what kind of person I was becoming, and I wanted you to know that in here, I'm trying to become something different. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not even sure I deserve it. But I wanted to acknowledge that you were right, and I was wrong, and that matters to me now in a way it never did before. Respectfully, Marcus Webb Federal Penitentiary Camp. Jessup, Georgia. James folded the letter carefully and placed it in a file folder. He sat quietly for a long moment, not looking at Patricia, who had diplomatically returned her attention to her computer screen. The letter troubled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. When he'd terminated Marcus Webb, James had been certain in his righteousness, certain that he was correcting an injustice, enforcing accountability, protecting the organization and the people within it. And all of that had been true. But Marcus's letter suggested a more complicated reality, one where James's intervention had been a necessary awakening, but perhaps not framed with the kind of grace that might have allowed Marcus to understand the lesson more quickly, before the destruction had accumulated into felony charges and prison time. James had terminated Marcus to protect Speedway Logistics and its employees. He hadn't done it out of malice, but neither had he done it with any particular concern for what happened to Marcus Webb afterward. The man's subsequent legal troubles had been his own responsibility, his own consequences. That was the truth. But it was also true that a more measured response, a demotion, a required management training program, a clear statement that his behavior was unacceptable, but that redemption was possible, might have created space for Marcus to course correct without the complete destruction of his life. James called Robert Chen that afternoon. "I need to do something for someone," James said when his attorney picked up. "It's going to seem strange, and I need to explain why." He described the letter, the situation, Marcus's conviction. Robert listened without interrupting. "What do you want to do?" Robert asked finally. "I want to help with his appeal. I want to see if there's a way to reduce his sentence. The fraud was serious, but it was his first offense, and he was clearly working in a system that had normalized this behavior. The previous manager apparently engaged in the same conduct and was never prosecuted." "That's going to be complicated," Robert said carefully. "You'd essentially be testifying that the corporate culture at Speedway Logistics was complicit in creating the conditions for his crime. That opens up liability questions." "I know," James said, "but it's also true. And he's trying to understand what he did wrong. That deserves something." The legal process took months. Robert worked with a criminal appellate attorney to file a motion for sentence reduction, arguing that Marcus's conviction, while valid, reflected broader systemic issues at the facility level, and that the sentence was disproportionate to his role as a mid-level manager who had learned the practice from his supervisor. James gave a deposition describing the facility culture he'd found when he returned in his investigation role. He acknowledged that the organization's previous leadership had created an environment where corner-cutting and financial manipulation were tolerated. He testified that Marcus's fraud, while inexcusable, was not anomalous within the context of how the facility had been operating. It wasn't enough for full exoneration, but it was enough for consideration. The judge reduced Marcus's sentence by 18 months, making him eligible for release in approximately 1 year instead of 2. When the order was finalized, James had a package delivered to Marcus's assigned facility counselor at the federal penitentiary. Inside was a letter from James, a copy of the appellate filing, and information about a re-entry program that James had funded through a non-profit organization focused on employment assistance for formerly incarcerated individuals. Marcus, I received your letter. I've spent a great deal of time thinking about the day I fired you and about everything that followed. I want to be honest with you. I did what I believed was necessary at that moment. I still believe that. But I also want to acknowledge that I did it without much grace and without considering what might have come after. You're being released early. My attorney and I worked with the appeals court to argue for sentence reduction based on mitigating circumstances related to the facility culture. I'm not telling you this to create a debt you owe me. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that someone believed redemption was possible for you even when you were in a dark place. When you're released, there's a job waiting for you if you want it. Not at Speedway Logistics, that would create too many complications. But there's a logistics consulting firm that does operational audits for regional companies. They work with operations managers who are trying to establish ethical systems and identify where corners are being cut. The firm is called Integrity Logistics, and they're expecting to hear from you. You can take the job or refuse it. You can take the re-entry assistance or ignore it. But I wanted you to have options that didn't require you to disappear into grey market work or return to the systems that failed you the first time. You asked me, in your letter, if I thought you could become something different. I think everyone can if they're willing to do the work. The question isn't whether it's possible. The question is whether you want it badly enough to actually change. I believe you do. I'm betting money and credibility on that belief. Don't make me regret it. James Holloway Marcus Webb was released on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 years and 2 weeks after walking out of the Speedway Logistics facility for the last time as a terminated employee. He was 36 years old, unmarried, and had very few people in his life who remembered him as anything other than the man who'd gone to prison. He took the job with Integrity Logistics. It was considerably lower paying than his previous management position, but it came with genuine respect, something Marcus hadn't experienced in years. His job was to work with facility managers across the Southeast, helping them identify financial irregularities, ethical lapses, and systemic problems before they became criminal liabilities. James and Marcus didn't meet again until 18 months later, at a professional conference on logistics management in Charlotte. They encountered each other by chance in the hotel lobby, both waiting for coffee in the same line. Marcus recognized James first. He looked healthier than he had in the photograph from his mugshot. Thinner, stronger, his eyes clearer. "Mr. Holloway," Marcus said, his voice careful. "I didn't expect to see you here." James turned, studied him for a moment, and recognized the man. But he was different too. There was a humility in his bearing, but not the false humility of someone performing contrition. This was earned humility, the kind that came from understanding something about yourself at a fundamental level. "Marcus, how are you doing?" "Better," Marcus said. "Much better, actually. The work at Integrity Logistics it's been meaningful. I'm actually good at finding problems when I'm looking for them on behalf of the company rather than against it." They talked for 20 minutes in the hotel lobby, standing in line and then sitting in the coffee shop. Marcus described his work, the firms he'd consulted with, the systems he'd helped fix. James listened, and what he was really listening for was authenticity, the absence of performance, the presence of genuine transformation. By the end of the conversation, James was satisfied that Marcus had done the work. Not because the man had said anything spectacular, but because of what he hadn't said. He hadn't made excuses, hadn't blamed his past managers, hadn't tried to minimize the damage he'd caused. He'd simply described his life as it was now and how he was trying to be useful in it. "I want to tell you something," James said as they were about to part. When I fired you, I was certain I was doing the right thing. And I was. But I was also being somewhat self-righteous about it. I was proving a point, establishing my authority, using you as a cautionary tale for everyone else. That's not leadership. That's performance. Marcus looked at him carefully. You helped with my appeal. You vouched for me. That was more grace than I had any right to expect. That was justice, James said, but it came late. The grace would have been in helping you understand what you were doing while you still had the choice to do something different. I didn't offer that. I just withdrew my authority and let you fall. I needed to fall, Marcus said. I don't say that to absolve you of anything or to excuse myself. But objectively, I needed to experience consequences severe enough to force me to actually look at myself. A demotion wouldn't have done it. A training program wouldn't have done it. I was too far gone into my own rationalizations. James nodded slowly. Maybe that's true, but I could have been less certain about it. They exchanged contact information, and when they parted, it wasn't with the kind of closure that stories often require. It was open-ended, ambiguous, realistic. They'd both been shaped by that morning in the facility office, but they'd been shaped differently, and neither of them would ever fully understand the other's experience of it. The conversation affected James more than he expected. That evening, in his hotel room, he called his daughter Sarah, who was now 34 and working as a clinical therapist in Boston. I ran into someone today, he told her, someone I fired years ago. He went to prison and I helped him appeal his sentence. We just had coffee and talked about his life now. How was it? Sarah asked. Complicated. He's doing better, genuinely better. But I realized that I'd been somewhat harsh in how I dealt with him. I was right to terminate him, but I could have done it with more understanding of what would come after. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Dad, do you remember when I was 16 and I told you I'd failed my driver's test? Of course, you were devastated. And you didn't yell at me. You didn't ground me. You just said, okay, we'll get you a better instructor and you'll take it again. But I remember you being really calm about it, almost like the failure itself was the learning moment and anything punitive would have just been extra. I remember, James said. I think that's what you do, Sarah continued. I think you understand that consequences are often sufficient on their own, and that what people actually need is someone who believes they can do better. With Marcus, you gave him the consequence and eventually the belief. That's actually the right order, even if it doesn't feel graceful in the moment. After he hung up, James sat on the hotel bed and thought about his daughter's words. She'd become a therapist, she said, partly because of how her father had treated her failures as learning opportunities rather than character flaws. She'd wanted to do that for other people. He wondered how many people had been shaped by his actions in ways he'd never know. Marcus Webb certainly had, but also the drivers at the Atlanta facility, who'd seen their manager removed and replaced with someone who treated them with respect. Also the managers he'd had to terminate at the other facilities, who'd received clear messages about what accountability actually looked like. Authority, James had come to understand, was like water. It found its shape according to the container it was poured into. Harsh authority became cruel, ambiguous authority became confusing, but authority exercised with clarity and genuine concern for the people affected by it. That created something different. That created the conditions for real growth. Over the next several years, James maintained occasional contact with Marcus. The man steadily advanced in his consulting work, eventually becoming a senior consultant at Integrity Logistics, with a specialty in helping organizations create ethical systems that prevented the kind of corner-cutting that had characterized his earlier career. He became something of an expert in organizational culture, speaking at industry conferences about how to identify and correct systemic dishonesty before it became criminal. James continued to lead Speedway Logistics' southeastern operations, gradually expanding the company's footprint and reputation. The Atlanta facility became known as a model for ethical logistics management, with exceptionally low turnover and customer satisfaction scores that were among the highest in the industry. David, the driver James had promoted to senior dispatcher, eventually became facility manager. Promoted through the ranks because he understood the work and had earned genuine respect from the people he managed. Keisha retired after 8 more years, honored by a company-wide recognition program that highlighted her contributions and ensured she had a robust retirement package. Cassidy moved to the corporate office and, over time, developed dispatch systems that improved efficiency across all Speedway logistics facilities by helping managers make real-time adjustments rather than relying on predetermined routes. 10 years after that Tuesday morning, when he'd fired Marcus Webb, James was invited to speak at a national logistics management conference about leadership, accountability, and organizational culture. The organizers had seen the remarkable operational improvements at Speedway Logistics and wanted to understand how James had achieved them. In his presentation, James talked about the importance of understanding rather than judgment, about the difference between authority and leadership, about the danger of assuming you know someone based on incomplete information. He talked about Marcus Webb by name, with permission, describing the situation without identifying the facility or glossing over the complexity of it. He talked about what he'd learned from that interaction, about how it had forced him to reconsider his own relationship with power and accountability. The most dangerous managers, he told the audience of several hundred logistics professionals, are the ones who are certain they're right. Certainty closes off the possibility of understanding. And without understanding, you can't actually lead effectively. You can only control. And control always fails eventually. In the audience, Marcus Webb listened from the third row, and when James finished speaking and took questions, Marcus stood up during the open forum portion. "I'm Marcus Webb," he said, his voice steady. "I'm the person you referenced in your presentation. I want to add something to what you said. When you fired me, I hated you. I was convinced you were wrong and I was right. But what I didn't understand then, and what I've come to understand over the years, is that your certainty about my unfitness for that role was actually correct. But more than that, your certainty was delivered with such clarity that it eventually forced me to examine myself rather than defend myself. If you'd been uncertain or apologetic, or had softened your message, I would have spent the next 10 years angry and self-righteous. Instead, I spent the next 10 years trying to become the kind of person who could work in the environment you were creating." James listened, and what he felt was something between vindication and humility. Marcus was right. The intervention had worked, but not because James had been particularly graceful. It had worked because James had been clear, and clarity, even delivered harshly, has a certain power to cut through self-deception. But then Marcus added one more thing. "What I want to say to Mr. Holloway, and to everyone here, is that clarity without compassion is just cruelty." And Mr. Holloway did eventually add the compassion part. He worked on my appeal. He gave me a path forward. That's what transformed the experience from a punishment into a lesson. The conference audience applauded, and James felt something shift in his understanding of that original morning. It wasn't that he'd been wrong to be harsh. It wasn't that compassion retroactively justified the harshness. It was that both had been necessary. The clarity to break through the denial, and then the compassion to offer a path forward. After the conference, James and Marcus had dinner together. They talked about their work, their families, the people they'd both touched and changed over the years. And at the end of the evening, Marcus said something that stayed with James for the rest of his life. "You asked me once if I thought I could become something different. I want to tell you, I did. But not because I wanted to impress you or prove you wrong or earn your approval. I became something different because you believed it was possible. And belief, when it comes from someone who has authority over you, is a powerful thing. It can crush you or elevate you. In your case, you used it to elevate me, but only after you'd crushed the old version first. That's the thing I want to tell anyone reading about this. Sometimes the people we need to dismiss from our lives are the ones who teach us the most about how to live differently." Years continued to pass. James eventually handed over day-to-day management of Speedway Logistics to a new regional director and moved into a consulting role, advising on organizational culture and leadership development. He worked with schools and non-profits and government agencies, any organization where people were trying to do difficult work and needed to understand how to lead effectively. He and Marcus became friends, in the way that two people can become friends after surviving something intense together. They didn't see each other constantly, but they stayed in touch, and when they did spend time together, they fell naturally into deep conversation. The kind of conversation that's only possible between people who've seen the worst in each other and chosen to continue anyway. When James was 68 years old, he received a call from Marcus. Marcus was getting married to a woman he'd met at a professional conference, another consultant in the same firm. He wanted James to come to the wedding, not as a guest, but as someone who'd been essential to making the wedding possible at all. "I wouldn't have met her. I wouldn't have had the career. I wouldn't have any of this life," Marcus said on the phone. "Without that morning in your office, without what came after." "You would have had a different life," James said, "not necessarily worse, just different." "Maybe," Marcus acknowledged. "But I think different in this case means worse. I think I was headed towards something ugly if you hadn't intervened." The wedding was held in Charlotte on a Saturday in late May. It was small and elegant, and when the officiant asked if anyone had objections or insights to share about the couple, James stood up and spoke. He talked about Marcus as he'd been that first day, ambitious, certain, blind to his own blindness. He talked about the termination, about what had come after. And then he talked about redemption, about the possibility of becoming different, about how that possibility requires both clarity and compassion, both consequences and belief. 20 years ago, James said, looking at Marcus and his fiancée, Eleanor, "I fired this man because he needed to understand something about himself that he wasn't willing to see. I was certain, and my certainty was delivered without grace. But grace came later, in the form of second chances and roads forward. The man standing here today is not the man I fired, but he also wouldn't be here if that firing hadn't happened. Sometimes our worst moments contain the seeds of our greatest transformation. Sometimes we have to be knocked down in order to understand what we're actually capable of building." He raised his glass. "To Marcus and Elena, and to the long, difficult, beautiful work of becoming who we're meant to be." After the wedding, as James was gathering his things to leave, Elena approached him. "Thank you for coming," she said, "and for what you said. Marcus has told me about his past, about how it shaped him, but hearing it from you, hearing it in the context of what you've learned about yourself, that meant something." "He's a good man," James said. "He became a good man because he was willing to look at himself honestly and change. That's rarer than it should be." "He became a good man because someone believed it was possible," Eleanor said, and James recognized his daughter's words in her voice, the understanding that belief itself is a powerful force. Driving back to Atlanta that evening, James thought about the arc of his life. 30 years as a driver and logistics manager, 18 months of retirement, 2 years undercover in his own company, and then 15 years rebuilding Speedway Logistics into something that worked better for everyone involved. And woven through all of it, the story of Marcus Webb, the young manager who'd confused control with leadership and learned, through the hardest possible experience, what actually mattered. He thought about how different his own life might have been if someone had handled his mistakes and failures with more grace. He'd been fortunate in his mentors and supervisors, people who'd believed in him and pushed him and sometimes disappointed him, but always with the underlying certainty that he was capable of more than he currently understood. He'd tried to be that for Marcus eventually, not at first, but eventually. And that, James understood, was perhaps the most important lesson. That redemption rarely comes in a single moment of grace. It comes in a sequence of moments, some harsh, some kind, some clear, some confusing, until finally you look back and realize you're no longer the person you were. The quiet delivery driver who'd been fired on his first day was now a retired logistics executive who'd quietly transformed his own company and, perhaps more importantly, the life of one man who'd been willing to change. It was never the story that got told at industry conferences or written up in business magazines. The real work of leadership was always like this: quiet, sustained, sometimes painful, almost never recognized until years had passed and someone looked back and realized that their entire life had been different because someone believed they could be better. James drove through the Atlanta night, past the Speedway Logistics facility where it had all begun, where the quiet man in worn boots had walked onto the loading dock and changed everything by simply refusing to hide what he actually was. James drove through the Atlanta night, past the Speedway Logistics facility where it had all begun, where the quiet man in worn boots had walked onto the loading dock and changed everything by simply refusing to hide what he actually was. The facility was dark now, the late hour meaning only the skeleton night crew remained. 2 dispatchers monitoring overnight deliveries, 1 security guard making his rounds. James had the security code. He could go inside whenever he wanted. Instead, he continued driving, letting the familiar streets guide him toward home, toward the quiet house on Candler Park Drive, where his wife, Catherine, was likely still awake, waiting for him to return from Charlotte. Catherine had been his partner for 34 years, though they'd known each other since they were teenagers in the same high school. She'd watched his entire career arc with the kind of patient understanding that comes from genuinely knowing someone. When he'd returned to Speedway Logistics undercover, she'd questioned the decision carefully but hadn't opposed it. When he'd sent money to help with Marcus Webb's appeal, she'd asked him why, and when he'd explained, she'd nodded and said simply, "That sounds like something you needed to do." He found her on the back porch when he arrived home, wrapped in one of his old cardigans despite the mild May warmth, reading a book by the amber light of the porch lamp. "How was the wedding?" she asked, setting her book aside as he sat down beside her. "Good." Marcus looked happy. Elena seems genuinely fond of him, which is what matters most. Catherine smiled slightly. "Do you know what I realized recently? I've known you for 42 years, and I've watched you care about people in the most concrete, practical ways. You don't do grand gestures, you just consistently show up and do the work. I think Marcus experienced that, and it changed him." "I fired him," James said. "That was the opposite of showing up. You fired him because he needed to be fired, and then you showed up after." Catherine reached over and took his hand. "That's not cruelty, that's integrity. You do what's right, even when it's hard, and then you see the person through the consequences." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the Atlanta night. Distant traffic, the hum of the city, crickets in the garden. James felt the tiredness of travel settling into his bones, but also something else, a sense of rightness, of having been part of something that mattered. "Sarah called while you were gone," Catherine said eventually. "She wanted to know if we'd heard from you. I told her you were speaking at a conference. Did she mention anything else?" "She said her practice has been growing. She's thinking about specializing more in how organizational trauma affects individuals, people who've experienced difficult management situations, harsh work environments, that kind of thing. I think she's been influenced by your stories about Speedway Logistics." James turned to look at his wife. "She's become a therapist, partly because of how I treated her failures growing up. And now she's going to specialize in helping people recover from exactly the kind of environment I once created. She's going to help people because you taught her that people are capable of change," Catherine corrected gently. "That's a different thing entirely." The next morning, James woke early, as he always did. The habit of early rising from decades of starting work before dawn was too deeply ingrained to break, even in retirement. He made coffee, prepared breakfast, and moved through the quiet house with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from routine deeply lived. He checked his email and found a message from Robert Chen, his attorney, marked urgent. The subject line read, "Re-Speedway Logistics Audit, New Development." The message contained a summary of findings from an internal audit that had been ongoing for 3 months. The audit had been triggered by an anonymous tip about potential financial irregularities at one of the other regional facilities, not Atlanta, but the Memphis distribution center that had been showing strong performance metrics despite some concerning revenue patterns. What the auditors had found was systematic fraud similar to what Marcus Webb had engaged in, but larger in scale and involving the facility manager and 2 senior dispatchers working in concert. They'd been falsifying delivery records, inflating mileage claims, and siphoning off approximately $200,000 annually. The Memphis facility manager, according to Robert's email, had been with the company for 16 years and had no prior history of concerns. He'd been promoted internally, had received consistently positive performance reviews, and had been considered a model manager by his peers. James read the email twice, then called Robert directly. "How did we miss this?" James asked without preamble. "We didn't have the audit systems in place to catch it," Robert replied. "After the Marcus Webb situation, we implemented better financial controls at Atlanta, but we weren't retroactively applying them across all facilities. This is exactly the kind of thing that happens when one region is tightened, and others are left with outdated oversight. Who's recommending termination? Everyone. It's clear-cut fraud. The evidence is overwhelming. But I wanted to talk to you first because I know how you approach the web situation, and I wanted to make sure you weren't going to try to rescue this manager as well. James was quiet for a moment. Who's the Memphis manager? Calvin Torres. Been there since 2008. Married with 2 kids. Wife is a nurse. Kids are in college. Send me everything, James said. Full file, timeline, all of it. I want to understand how this happened and why no one caught it. That afternoon, James was in a video conference with the Memphis facility staff, standing in the facility manager's office with Calvin Torres sitting across from him, looking confused. The 2 senior dispatchers who were involved in the fraud had been separated and placed on paid suspension, pending the investigation outcome. Calvin looked like a man whose world was collapsing. Because it was. I don't understand, Calvin was saying, his accent carrying the Spanish inflection of someone who'd grown up in a bilingual household. The numbers are right. The deliveries are accurate. What are you saying? The deliveries are accurate, James confirmed. But the mileage claims are inflated, and the efficiency reports have been manually adjusted to reflect better performance than actually occurred. That's what our auditors found. Calvin's face went white. I know there have been some adjustments, but I thought that was standard. The previous manager, he said that's how you had to report to keep corporate happy. That's how you showed progress. James felt something in his chest tighten. That's not how we report. That's fraud. I know that now, but when I took over the facility, things were already working that way. I inherited the system. I didn't create it. You perpetuated it, James said, and his voice was flat, emotionless in a way that made the accusation hit harder. You took over a system that was dishonest, and instead of fixing it, you continued it. For 8 years. Calvin started to respond, then stopped. His shoulders sagged. What happens now? You're terminated for cause, James said. I'm calling your wife to arrange a severance meeting with our HR team. You'll receive 2 months of salary as severance, but your benefits end in 30 days. You have 2 hours to collect your personal items from this office. As he spoke the words, James was very aware of the parallel to that afternoon in Marcus Webb's office 18 years earlier. But this situation felt different. This wasn't a new manager making a mistake out of ignorance. This was a long-term manager who'd had years to address the problem and had chosen not to. Or had he? That evening, James requested Calvin Torres's complete personnel file. He spent hours reviewing performance reviews, incident reports, emails, and communications spanning 16 years. What he found was a picture of gradual normalization of dishonesty, a culture where cutting corners was accepted, where inflating numbers to meet corporate expectations was standard practice, where no one above the facility level had ever questioned the inconsistencies in the reporting structure. The previous Memphis manager, according to the file, had retired 7 years earlier with commendations for his strong operational performance. Those commendations, James now understood, had been based partially on falsified data, and the culture that man had created, the understanding that this was how you survived in the logistics business, had been inherited by Calvin. James picked up the phone and called Calvin at his home number. I need to ask you something, James said without preamble. The system you inherited, did you ever try to fix it? There was a long silence on the other end. Once, Calvin said finally, about 4 years ago, I suggested to the corporate office that we might be using an outdated reporting method. I was told that if the numbers were working and the operation was solid, I shouldn't fix things that weren't broken. That was the feedback I got. Who told you that? The previous regional manager. His name was Harrison. He said that as long as my facility was performing, I shouldn't rock the boat by questioning how we got there. James felt the scope of the problem expand. This wasn't just Marcus Webb's poor judgment or Calvin Torres's passive participation in fraud. This was systemic. This was a company culture that had been built over years on the principle that the numbers mattered more than the means by which they were achieved. The next morning, James called an emergency meeting with his board of directors. He presented them with the full scope of what he'd found. Not just the Memphis fraud, but the underlying cultural systems that had permitted and encouraged it. We have a problem, he told them, that goes deeper than any single manager or facility. We have a corporate culture that rewards performance over integrity. We have reporting systems that obscure reality. We have oversight structures that are insufficient. And most importantly, we have a history of punishing people who point out that the system is broken. What are you recommending? Victoria Simmons asked. I'm recommending a complete internal audit of all facilities, all reporting systems, all financial practices over the past 10 years. I'm recommending we bring in external auditors to do a comprehensive compliance review. And I'm recommending we implement new cultural standards that make it clear that integrity is non-negotiable, even when it means lower performance metrics. That's going to be expensive, Roger Yates said, and it's going to expose us to liability if we find more fraud. We're already exposed to liability, James replied quietly. We just don't know the full extent of it yet. The question is whether we want to find out proactively, on our terms, or whether we want to wait until the government finds it and punishes us for it. The board voted unanimously to proceed with the audit, though James could see the reluctance in some of their faces. Within a week, teams of external auditors were on site at all 4 of Speedway Logistics' southeastern facilities, combing through years of records and data. What they found was both worse and better than James had anticipated. The Memphis fraud was the most significant, but smaller irregularities existed at 2 of the other facilities. Nothing criminal, but all of it indicating the same cultural problem: a willingness to bend the truth for the sake of performance metrics. But the Atlanta facility, the one James had rebuilt after removing Marcus Webb, was clean. Thoroughly, completely clean, not just in terms of financial records, but in terms of the systemic culture. The drivers weren't afraid to report problems. The dispatchers weren't pressured to falsify records. The managers weren't incentivized to hide reality. The difference, James understood, was that the Atlanta facility had experienced a reset, a moment where the old culture had been visibly dismantled and replaced with something different. Everyone who worked there knew that Marcus Webb had been fired for lying about customer service and then later discovered to be engaged in fraud. They knew that accountability had real consequences, but they also knew that James had offered Marcus a path forward, which created an understanding that mistakes didn't have to be permanent, but they did have to be addressed honestly. Over the next 6 months, James worked with an organizational development consultant to completely overhaul Speedway Logistics' corporate culture. They created new reporting systems that made financial accuracy a primary metric rather than a secondary consideration. They restructured compensation so that managers weren't penalized if they reported problems honestly. They implemented mandatory ethics training, and most importantly, they created clear pathways for whistleblowers and people who wanted to address problems without fear of retaliation. Calvin Torres, in the meantime, was fighting to rebuild his life. His wife had taken the news of his termination and the underlying fraud with the kind of stoicism that suggested she'd been preparing for this possibility, even if she didn't consciously acknowledge it. His younger son, who was in his 2nd year of college, had continued without interruption. But his older daughter had decided to take a year off school and move home to help support the family financially. James had authorized the 2 months of severance, but he'd also done something else. He'd personally funded the continuation of Calvin's health insurance for 6 months, on the condition that Calvin use part of that time to complete ethics training through a non-profit organization that specialized in rehabilitation for employees involved in corporate fraud cases. He'd also, in a quiet conversation with Robert Chen, authorized an additional cash transfer to Calvin's account, not because James forgave the fraud, but because James had come to understand that he'd been part of the system that had created the conditions for Calvin to commit it. "Isn't that enabling?" Robert had asked carefully. "It's justice," James had replied. "If Calvin had come to us when he first recognized the system was dishonest, instead of just going along with it, he wouldn't be in this situation. That's a failure of our corporate responsibility. We need to own that failure." Calvin reached out to James 6 months after his termination. He was working in a warehouse for a different company, making significantly less money than he'd made at Speedway Logistics. But he'd completed the ethics training and was working with a therapist to understand how he'd allowed himself to participate in something he knew was wrong. "I wanted to thank you," Calvin said in an email. Not for firing me, that was necessary, but for making it possible for me to face what I'd done and start rebuilding. A lot of employers would have just made me disappear. You made me take responsibility, but you also made it possible to come out the other side. James's response was brief. Don't thank me for doing what should have been done from the beginning. Thank yourself for being willing to change. That's the hard part. 2 years after the Memphis fraud was discovered, James sat down with Marcus Webb and Calvin Torres together for the first time. It wasn't a casual meeting. James had specifically arranged it because he wanted both men to understand that they weren't alone in their experience, that the system that had shaped their failures was a company-wide problem, not a personal one. The three of them met in a private conference room in Charlotte, a neutral location chosen deliberately to avoid triggering anyone's memories of facility offices and terminations. I brought you together, James began, because I think you both deserve to understand something about your situations that I didn't fully understand until recently. You were both operating within a corporate system that had normalized dishonesty. Marcus, you inherited that culture from a previous manager. Calvin, you inherited it from your predecessor. Neither of you created the system, but both of you perpetuated it. The difference is what happened after you were caught. James looked at Marcus. You went to prison. You lost everything. And then you chose to rebuild based on integrity, instead of just resurfacing and pretending nothing happened. That's extraordinary. Then he looked at Calvin. You accepted termination and went through the hard work of understanding how you allowed yourself to participate in fraud. You're rebuilding at a lower level, but you're rebuilding honestly. That's also extraordinary. I'm not extraordinary, Marcus said quietly. I was desperate. Prison does that to you. It strips away all your defenses and forces you to actually look at yourself. And I'm not sure I've really rebuilt anything, Calvin added. I'm just trying to be honest going forward. That's all any of us can do, James said. But here's what I want you both to understand. The system failed you. I failed you. I was part of the company leadership, and I didn't create a culture where you would have felt safe reporting the dishonesty you encountered. I'm taking responsibility for that. James pulled out a document. It was a memo addressed to the entire Speedway Logistics workforce, written and signed by James, acknowledging the fraud that had been discovered, taking responsibility for the corporate culture that had enabled it, and outlining the new systems being implemented to prevent it in the future. I'm sharing this with everyone, James said, because I think people deserve to understand that their leadership recognizes its own complicity in the problems the company has faced. That's the only way a culture really changes, when the people at the top stop blaming individuals and start examining systems. Marcus and Calvin both read the memo carefully. When Calvin finished, he looked up at James with visible emotion. That takes courage, Calvin said. Most executives wouldn't do that. Most executives are more interested in protecting their reputation than protecting their company, James replied. I spent enough of my life chasing reputation. I want to spend the rest of it chasing integrity. After the meeting, James had lunch with Marcus while Calvin headed to the airport to catch a flight back to wherever his life had taken him. They sat in a quiet restaurant in Charlotte's uptown, and Marcus told James about his work, his marriage, his life as someone who'd rebuilt from nothing. I've been thinking about something, Marcus said as they finished eating, about the moment you fired me. I've replayed it thousands of times, and I've gone through every iteration of it. Anger, shame, self-pity, victimhood. But what I've finally come to understand is that it was necessary, not because I deserved to be humiliated, but because I needed to be stopped. I was on a path that would have destroyed my life, regardless of whether you'd intervened. You might have found another way to stop yourself, James said. Maybe. But I didn't. And I probably wouldn't have. I was too invested in being right, in being superior, in winning. Without that intervention, I just would have kept going until the consequences were even worse. James nodded slowly. I've realized something similar about Calvin, and about myself. We're all operating within systems that shape us in ways we don't fully understand until something forces us to look at them. My job as a leader is to create systems that make it harder to ignore those pressures. Is that possible? Marcus asked. Can you really create a system that prevents people from rationalizing dishonesty? No, James said, But you can create a system where the pressure to be dishonest is lower, where the incentives are aligned with integrity, where people feel safe reporting problems. You can't eliminate the human tendency to rationalize and cut corners, but you can make it harder to do. That evening, James returned home to Catherine, waiting on the same back porch where they'd sat after the wedding. She'd clearly been expecting him, had a bottle of wine open and 2 glasses ready. "How did it go?" she asked as he settled into the chair beside her. "It was necessary," James said. "I think both Marcus and Calvin needed to understand that their experiences weren't just personal failures, but failures of systems I was responsible for creating. That must have been difficult to acknowledge." "It was," James admitted, "but it's also true. I built a company, and the company had values embedded in it. Values about what was acceptable, what was rewarded, what was overlooked. When people acted in ways that reflected those values, and then faced consequences for acting that way, it was partially my responsibility." Catherine poured wine into both glasses. "Do you regret building the company?" "No," James said. "I regret the values I embedded in it. But those can be changed. That's what we're in the process of doing." "And Marcus? Do you regret how you handled him?" "I regret that I was so certain I was right that I didn't consider how to help him understand what he was doing in real time instead of after the fact. But I don't regret the termination itself. Some interventions require that kind of clarity." They drank wine as the sun set, painting the Atlanta evening in shades of orange and purple. James thought about the trajectory of his life, the driver who'd worked his way up, the manager who'd believed in his own righteousness, the owner who'd eventually understood that his own power had been built on assumptions that weren't always true. He thought about Marcus Webb, who'd gone to prison and come out reformed. He thought about Calvin Torres, who'd benefited from a culture that had never demanded honesty and was now trying to figure out how to live differently. He thought about the Atlanta facility, which had become a model of operational excellence precisely because it had experienced a visible reset where the old culture was dismantled. And he thought about the realization that had been dawning on him for years now, that the most important work of leadership wasn't in grand strategic decisions or impressive performance metrics. It was in the small daily choices to operate with integrity, to take responsibility for systems that had gone wrong, to believe that people could change, and to create the conditions where that change could actually happen. "What are you thinking about?" Catherine asked, noticing his distant expression. "I'm thinking about the man I was when I first started at Speedway Logistics. I was confident, I was certain, I was driven, and I was building a company on foundations that looked solid but were actually quite fragile. And now I'm less certain, and I think that's okay. Maybe that's the only kind of certainty worth having, the kind that's earned through mistakes and failures and the willingness to acknowledge when you've been wrong." Catherine reached over and took his hand. "That's why people follow you," she said, "not because you're always right, but because you're willing to admit when you're wrong and do something about it. That's rare." The next morning, James received a call from Sarah, his daughter. She'd heard about the memo he'd written to the Speedway Logistics workforce, and she wanted to talk about it. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, "for what you wrote, for how you handled it. That's the kind of leadership that heals organizations." "I wish I'd understood it earlier," James replied. "I could have prevented a lot of damage." "You understand it now," Sarah said, "and you're using that understanding to change how the company operates. That's what matters." After they hung up, James sat at his kitchen table and thought about his daughter's career, about how she was building a therapy practice around helping people recover from organizational trauma. She'd become a healer partly because of how he'd treated her failures as learning opportunities rather than character flaws. And now she was going to help others do the same kind of healing work. The circle kept expanding. His actions rippled outward, affecting people he'd never met directly, changing systems he didn't fully understand. That had always been true, but he'd only recently become conscious of it. By afternoon, James was in his office at the corporate headquarters in Nashville, meeting with the new chief operating officer he'd hired to help implement the cultural changes at Speedway Logistics. Her name was Dr. Patricia Morrison, and she'd spent 20 years as an organizational development consultant for Fortune 500 companies. "I've reviewed the audit findings," she said, laying out a presentation on the conference table. And I have good news and bad news. The good news is that the fraud wasn't as widespread as we initially feared. The bad news is that the underlying culture that permitted it is more deeply embedded than we realized. What does that mean? James asked. It means that firing managers and implementing new policies won't be sufficient. We need to do a complete cultural reset. New values statement, new hiring practices, new promotion criteria, new performance metrics. We need to rebuild this company from the ground up in terms of its understanding of what success looks like. How long will that take? Years, Patricia said directly. You're not just changing policies, you're changing people's fundamental understanding of what's acceptable. That takes time. But it's possible, and I believe it's necessary. Over the next 2 years, James worked with Patricia to implement a comprehensive cultural transformation at Speedway Logistics. They rewrote job descriptions to emphasize integrity alongside performance. They changed how managers were evaluated, making ethics and ethical culture part of their performance reviews. They restructured compensation so that managers were rewarded for honest reporting rather than penalized for it. They also did something more radical. They created an internal fellowship program specifically designed to help employees who'd made mistakes or engaged in dishonest behavior to understand what had happened and rebuild their careers based on integrity. The program was named after Marcus Webb, the Marcus Webb Fellowship for Ethical Leadership, because James believed it was important to publicly acknowledge the connection between understanding failure and creating change. Marcus himself helped design the fellowship. He worked with James and Patricia to develop curriculum, interview candidates, and mentor fellows as they went through the program. By the time the program had been running for 2 years, it had helped 17 people recover from situations similar to the ones Marcus and Calvin had experienced. Calvin Torres was one of the fellows in the second cohort. After leaving the warehouse job, he'd applied to the fellowship specifically to work on understanding how he'd allowed himself to participate in fraud and to develop a new understanding of what leadership could look like based on integrity rather than performance metrics. The fellowship included a 3-month intensive training program, monthly mentorship meetings with established leaders who'd experienced similar failures, and a job placement support program that helped fellows transition into roles at other companies where they could apply what they'd learned. When Calvin completed the fellowship, James met with him privately. "What's next for you?" James asked. "I've been offered a position with a logistics company in Atlanta," Calvin replied. "Not at the operational management level I was at before, but at a level where I can work on implementing the kind of cultural systems we've been talking about." The company heard about the fellowship program and wanted someone who'd been through it, someone who understood from personal experience how culture shapes behavior. "That's excellent," James said. "Are you ready for it?" "I'm nervous," Calvin admitted. "But yes, I think I am. I've spent 2 years understanding why I made the choices I did, and I've thought a lot about what I would do differently if I had the chance. This job feels like that chance." "You do have that chance," James said. "The question is whether you have the courage to build something different." "I think I do," Calvin said, "because I know what the alternative is. I've experienced the consequences of not building something different. I don't want to live that way again." James walked Calvin out of his office, and as they said goodbye, James felt something shift in his understanding of his own journey. He'd spent years believing that his role was to fix problems, to hire and fire managers, to implement systems, to correct failures. But increasingly, he was understanding that his real role was to create environments where people could fix themselves, could understand their own failures, and could choose to rebuild based on integrity. That was harder than being the person who made all the decisions, but it was also more sustainable, more human, and ultimately more effective. The next time James saw Marcus Webb was at the annual Speedway Logistics Leadership Conference. 5 years after the Memphis fraud had been discovered, the conference brought together facility managers, operations leaders, and senior staff from across the company. James had arranged for Marcus to give a keynote presentation about his experiences, the original termination, the subsequent fraud discovery, the fellowship program, and how he'd rebuilt his career and his life. Marcus stood in front of 300 logistics professionals and told his story with remarkable honesty. He talked about the young man he'd been, ambitious, insecure, driven by a need to prove himself through control over others. He talked about that morning in James's office, about the shock of being fired, about the years that followed. "I'm going to tell you something that nobody wants to hear," Marcus said, looking out at the audience. "My termination was justified, completely. I was a bad manager. I was insecure. I was harsh. I was using my authority to compensate for my own doubts about my competence. And when my boss fired me, he was doing what needed to be done." He paused, letting that sink in. "But here's what I also know. That manager, his name is James Holloway, and he's here in this audience, could have simply fired me and let me fall. He could have gone back to his office and never thought about me again. Instead, he eventually chose to invest in my redemption. He worked on my appeal. He gave me a path forward. And he created a fellowship program specifically designed so that my experience could be turned into an opportunity for others to learn from their mistakes without destroying their lives in the process." Marcus looked directly at James. "What I want to say to every manager in this room is this. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to hire people who aren't right for their roles. You're going to implement systems that have unintended consequences. You're going to discover that people you trusted were engaged in dishonesty. That's not a failure of leadership. That's a fact of operating any human organization. The question is what you do after you discover the problem." The audience was completely quiet. "If you use it as an opportunity to prove how much smarter you are than the people who failed, you're going to create an organization of people who are afraid to fail, which means they're afraid to try anything new. But if you use it as an opportunity to understand the systems that created the failure and to rebuild those systems so they're less likely to fail in the future, then you're creating an organization where people can actually grow." After the presentation, Marcus was surrounded by managers wanting to talk to him, wanting to understand more about his journey, wanting to discuss how they could implement similar approaches at their own facilities. James watched from across the room, feeling a quiet satisfaction at seeing this man, who'd been fired in shame 5 years earlier, now recognized as an expert on organizational culture and leadership ethics. Later that evening, James and Marcus sat together in the hotel bar, nursing drinks and talking about how far they'd both come. "I never thought I'd be standing in front of 300 people telling them about the day I was fired," Marcus said. "I thought that was the worst day of my life. In some ways, it was. But it was also the beginning of my actual life, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense," James replied. "The worst days and the best days are often the same day, just viewed from different perspectives." "I've been thinking about something," Marcus said, "about how different my life would be if you'd been less harsh about my termination, if you'd given me another chance or handled it with more grace. How would it be different? I think I would have stayed at Speedway Logistics, eventually risen higher, and eventually ended up in exactly the situation Calvin Torres did, perpetuating dishonest systems because I wasn't forced to actually examine what I was doing. The harshness was necessary. It was the only thing that would break through my denial." James considered this. "I think you're right. And I think that's the hardest lesson for any leader. That sometimes the kindest thing you can do is to be absolutely clear about what isn't working. Because clarity, even when it's difficult, is what allows people to actually change." "Is that a philosophy you try to apply consistently?" Marcus asked. "I'm trying to," James said, "though I'm also learning that clarity without compassion eventually becomes cruelty. The balance is in providing both clear standards about what's acceptable and what isn't, but also genuine investment in helping people meet those standards or understanding why they failed to." They talked for another hour, covering everything from logistics operations to personal philosophy, from family to the future. When they finally stood to leave, James felt the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from having invested in someone's growth and watching that investment pay off in ways that extended far beyond the original relationship. The next morning, James woke early, as always, and went for a run through the streets of Nashville. He was 72 years old, and he ran because it kept him healthy, but also because it gave him time to think without distraction, to process his life in a way that sitting still never allowed. As he ran past the city landmarks he'd known for decades, James thought about the arc of his career, from driver to manager to owner to cultural architect. Each phase had taught him something different, and each phase had also revealed something about his own blindness, his own assumptions, his own need to keep learning and growing. He thought about Marcus Webb, who'd been fired in shame and had rebuilt himself into someone whose wisdom about organizational culture was now sought by major corporations. He thought about Calvin Torres, who'd benefited from a system that had failed him and was now going to help others avoid the same failures. He thought about the Atlanta facility, which had become a model precisely because it had experienced a visible reset, where old patterns were broken and new ones were built. And he thought about Sarah, his daughter, who was building a therapy practice around helping people recover from the kind of organizational trauma that he'd inadvertently created. The healing work was extending beyond his direct actions into the world through his children, through the people he'd influenced, through the systems he'd helped build. By the time James returned home from his run, Catherine had breakfast ready, as she always did. They ate together on the back porch, watching the Nashville morning light up with possibility. "You're thinking about something," Catherine observed, as she did whenever she sensed James was processing something significant. "I'm thinking about how long it took me to understand that the point of power isn't to control people or situations," James said. "The point is to create conditions where people can make better choices than they would have otherwise. That's been the real lesson of all of this." "And have you created those conditions?" "At Speedway Logistics, yes. Imperfectly, but yes. In my family, I think so, though I probably failed in some ways I'm still not conscious of. In myself," he trailed off, considering, "in myself, I'm still working on it." Catherine smiled. "That's the only honest answer anyone can give." 3 years after Marcus's keynote presentation, James decided to retire fully from his role at Speedway Logistics. He was 75 years old, and he'd spent the last 8 years working on cultural transformation. The company was now operating at peak efficiency, with ethics embedded at every level. The Marcus Webb Fellowship had helped over 50 people rebuild their careers based on integrity. The Atlanta facility had become the flagship location for the entire company, showcasing what was possible when culture was prioritized alongside performance. James had selected his successor, a woman named Dr. Elena Martinez, who brought both operational expertise and genuine commitment to the cultural values James had spent years embedding in the company. Elena had been working with Patricia Morrison to understand the long-term vision, and she was ready to lead the company into its next phase. At James's retirement celebration, held at the same conference center where Marcus had given his keynote presentation years earlier, nearly 500 people gathered, current and former employees, members of the Marcus Webb Fellowship, logistics industry colleagues, and of course his family. Marcus Webb and Calvin Torres both attended, now friends and colleagues in the work of building ethical organizational cultures. Sarah gave a speech about how her father's approach to leadership had influenced her therapy practice. Catherine spoke about the man she'd known for 50 years, how he'd continuously evolved and never stopped questioning his own assumptions. When it was James's turn to speak, he stood and looked out at the assembled group, people whose lives had been changed by his decisions, for better or worse, and whose presence represented the ongoing work of building something better. "I'm not good at accepting recognition," James began. "I never have been. The work of leadership, the work of building organizations and helping people grow, that's supposed to be its own reward, or so I've always told myself. But standing here, looking at all of you, I'm recognizing something I should have acknowledged long ago." He looked directly at Marcus. "To the people I've fired, I want to say that I hope my eventual investment in your redemption balanced out the harshness of the termination. I hope I've become more understanding of the complexity of organizational failure. And I want to say that every one of you who rebuilt your lives and chose integrity despite the difficulty, you're the reason any of this mattered." He looked at Sarah. "To my children, who became the people I most wanted to be, I want to say that you taught me what good parenting actually looks like. You taught me that clear standards and genuine love aren't in conflict with each other. You taught me by example what I later tried to teach organizations." He looked at Catherine. "To my wife, who has listened to 50 years of me processing my failures and my victories with extraordinary patience. You've modeled what it looks like to care about someone's growth without needing to control it." And finally, he looked at the General Assembly. "To all of you who've been part of this journey, I want to say that the real work of leadership isn't in being right. It's in being willing to be wrong, to acknowledge it, and to do the hard work of rebuilding on better foundations. That's what I'm passing on. Not a perfect company or perfect systems, but a commitment to continuously examine ourselves and improve. After the celebration, James returned to his house in East Atlanta for the last time as the active owner of Speedway Logistics. He packed the few personal items he kept in his office and arranged for them to be shipped home. He handed over all his accounts and access codes to Elena Martinez, who promised to maintain the values he'd embedded while adapting them to the future the company would face. In his final act as owner, James established an endowment, a substantial financial commitment that would fund the Marcus Webb Fellowship in perpetuity. The endowment was structured so that it would continue even if Speedway Logistics eventually changed ownership, ensuring that the work of helping people understand and rebuild from organizational failure would continue indefinitely. The next morning, James woke at home in his own bed, with nothing scheduled and no responsibilities calling him toward the day. It was the first time in 60 years that he'd experienced this kind of freedom. He made coffee, sat on his back porch as the sun rose, and allowed himself to simply be present with his life. Over the following months, James became a consultant to organizations interested in implementing cultural transformation programs similar to what he'd done at Speedway Logistics. He worked with non-profits and government agencies, helping them understand how to align their operations with their stated values. He mentored young leaders, trying to teach them the lessons he'd learned over decades. But mostly he spent time with Catherine, with his children and grandchildren, with Marcus and the community of people who'd been part of the journey. He read books he'd never had time for during his working life. He drove his old blue F-150 to places he'd never visited. He learned finally how to be quiet in a way that wasn't about preparing for the next challenge, but simply about being present to the life he'd lived. One afternoon, James received a letter from Calvin Torres. Calvin had moved into a senior operations role at his new company and was implementing the kind of cultural transformation that James had pioneered at Speedway Logistics. He wanted James to come speak to his team about leadership and ethics. James agreed, and 2 weeks later, he was standing in front of 30 logistics professionals at Calvin's facility, sharing the story of his career, his mistakes, and his eventual understanding of what real leadership meant. After his presentation, one of the young managers in the audience approached him. She couldn't have been more than 30, and she was clearly struggling with something. "I fired someone last week," she said, "and I wasn't very kind about it. I was trying to make a point, trying to establish that I was in charge. But now I'm wondering if I was too harsh, if I should have handled it differently." James recognized himself in her, recognized the need to be certain, the confusion between authority and respect. "Did the person deserve to be fired?" he asked. "Yes. They weren't performing, and they weren't willing to improve." "Then you were right to do it," James said. "The question now is what happens next. Are you going to cut them loose and let them disappear? Or are you going to invest in helping them understand what went wrong so they can make different choices in their next role?" The young manager looked uncertain. "That feels like a lot of responsibility." "It is," James said. "Leadership is responsibility. You can't avoid that by pretending it's just business. It's people's lives. And once you've affected their lives, you bear some responsibility for how they're affected." He gave her the contact information for the Marcus Webb Fellowship. "Consider sending them there," he said, "not as punishment, but as an opportunity. You'd be surprised how many people are capable of remarkable transformation when given the right environment." As James drove back to Atlanta that evening, he found himself reflecting on how the work continued to ripple outward. The young manager would reach out to the employee she'd fired. That employee would go through the fellowship. They would rebuild their career based on integrity. They would eventually influence the organizations they worked for, the people they managed, the systems they built. The circle kept expanding. The work kept continuing. And James, finally retired from the active responsibility of managing it all, felt a deep peace in understanding that he'd helped start something that would continue long after he was gone. He pulled into his driveway just as the sun was setting, turning the Atlanta sky into a canvas of orange and purple. Catherine was on the back porch, as she had been so many evenings during his working life, waiting for him to come home. "How was it?" she asked as he settled into the chair beside her. Good, James said. I think I helped someone understand something they needed to understand. And I realized that's all any of us can really do. Help each other understand a little better so we can make a little different choices, so we can build a little better systems, so the next generation doesn't have to make the same mistakes we did. Catherine poured wine into 2 glasses, and they sat in comfortable silence as the light faded and the stars began to emerge. The quiet delivery driver, who'd once been fired on his first day, who'd turned out to own every truck in the fleet, had finally understood that the real power had never been in the trucks or the company or even in the decisions. The real power had always been in the belief that people could change, in the willingness to invest in that change, and in the patience to let the transformation happen in its own time. And as darkness settled over the Atlanta night, James understood that he could finally rest, knowing that the work would continue without him, that the systems he'd built would persist, that the people he'd influenced would influence others, and that the quiet commitment to integrity and growth would ripple outward indefinitely, touching lives in ways he'd never fully know or understand. That was enough. That was everything. That was the only real legacy anyone could leave. Not a company or a fortune or even a reputation, but the understanding that human beings are capable of extraordinary transformation when given clarity, compassion, and genuine belief in their potential to change.